If you're American, you're familiar with the concept of the radical left mobilizing and what they like to call protests, but what many times have also turned into violent riots. If you watched my program last week, you know that similar protests have been taking place in Israel over the last 5 months. What we didn't talk about last week, however, was the fact that not only has the radical left mobilized with massive demonstrations and riots regarding the issue of judicial reform here in Israel, but they were planned and funded well in advance of Israel's new government being sworn in and before the judicial reform issue was even put on the table. I'm Luke, and this is the Israel Guys. Hello and welcome to the Israel Guys, where we believe that in a world of anti-Israel propaganda and Jew hatred, you should have a direct connection to the land and people of Israel. If you haven't done it yet, make sure you hit subscribe, hit all notifications, and let us know if you are a new viewer down in the comments section below. While the anti-judicial reform demonstrations in Israel that have taken center page news in international mainstream media for the last 5 months may be slowly dying down, their agenda has not. After months of weekly protests and hundreds of thousands of people showing up weekly in Tel Aviv and other major coastal cities to protest what they claimed was the end to Israeli democracy, as we discussed last week, a threat to Israel's democracy was never the real issue. How do we know? Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu and his coalition finally agreed to pause the judicial reform process while they worked out a compromise. Not surprisingly, even after this happened, the demonstrations continued. Recently, however, more information came to light that proves once again these mass demonstrations that sometimes turned violent and caused major disruptions to Israeli lives by blocking major intersections and highways and physically trying to stop members of Knesset from leaving their homes while making their lives miserable, that the protests were never really against the judicial reform plan. According to a recent interview given by one of the key protest organizers, these demonstrations were all about ousting Bibi Netanyahu and his right-wing government. Ehud Barak served as Israel's prime minister from 1999 to 2001. He's a retired general, and today he's known to be part of the radical left-wing movement here in Israel. In the last several years, he has vowed to bring down Bibi Netanyahu. And since Barak was one of Israel's shortest-serving prime ministers in their history, and Bibi is Israel's longest, it's possible that this is part of a personal vendetta against Bibi Netanyahu. Ehud Barak is the mastermind behind the Black Flags movement, which was reportedly funded by Jeffrey Epstein, who Barak was close friends and business partners with. The Black Flags movement, founded in 2019, had one goal: bring down Bibi Netanyahu and block him from forming a coalition government. So this week, Gilad Sher, he's a key protest organizer for the anti-judicial reform demonstrations and a part of Ehud Barak's inner circle. He's worked for him for many, many years. He revealed in an interview given recently on a podcast with Haaretz that these massive demonstrations were first planned and funded, largely funded by Ehud Barak in the wake of the November 2022 Israeli election results. And this is very key, before the judicial reform process was even announced. According to some claims, Ehud Barak has funded millions, if not tens of millions of shekels for these mass demonstrations that swept the country in the early part of 2023. This means that these mass demonstrations, which have sometimes reached numbers up to hundreds of thousands of people, were funded and planned well in advance of the current government being sworn in and well in advance of the very issues that these people were claiming to protest against. This also means that while there were certainly sincere Israeli citizens who were actually protesting the proposed judicial reform plan, there were likely many people who didn't have any idea why they were there. Indeed, we experienced this for ourselves when we went to several of the demonstrations in March of this year. So what does all of this mean? By compromising on the area of judicial reform, Israel's current government is playing right into the hand of Ehud Barak and his well-funded and well-planned anti-government movement. While his real goal was definitely to bring down Israel's longest-serving prime minister, step one of that plan was most certainly to get Bibi's government to capitulate. He even said this, as we'll see in a minute. Make no mistake, the radical extreme left is the same in America as it is in Israel. The goal is not to reach a compromise agreement on the real agenda issues that are currently on this government's table. These protesters have continually insisted they are protesting a reform plan that they claim would end democracy in the Jewish state. By planning, funding, and stating well in advance that they plan instead to bring down a leader and government who is elected by the majority in Israel, it is clear that they themselves intend to end democracy in Israel. The crazy thing is, they don't even try to hide it. For just a moment, I'd like you to imagine Sarah, a single mother in Israel. She works tirelessly day and night, but despite her efforts, she struggles to provide nutritious meals for her young children, Miriam and David. Today, you have the power to change that. For a donation of just $50, you can provide a food bag filled with fresh fruits, vegetables, bread, and other essential items, enough to feed a family like Sarah's for an entire week. Delivered late at night, these bags resemble any other supermarket delivery, preserving the dignity of the families that receive them. Now imagine Sarah startled by a late-night knock at the door. Outside, she discovers a bag filled with groceries. Relief washes over her as she realizes that she can now nourish Miriam and David for the week and perhaps even prepare their favorite dinner. This isn't about providing meals, it's about giving these families the freedom to prepare their own food to nourish themselves in a manner that feels normal, not charitable. You're offering them a key to regain their self-worth, to let children like Miriam and David experience the joys of being kids again. In Deuteronomy 15:11, the Bible teaches us, "For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in your land." So let's help eradicate poverty in Israel today, one bag at a time. Make a difference in the lives of mothers like Sarah and children like Miriam and David. Click the link in the description below to give a grocery bag to those in need today. So to give you just a couple of key takeaways, guys, from the issues that are happening here in Israel, it may seem like we've talked about these anti-judicial reform protests, demonstrations, and the government's plans a lot over the last several months, but it's been rather massive. If you're American especially, you're probably familiar with this idea of the radical left mobilizing into massive demonstrations that are very, very persistent and many times actually turning very violent. I don't think the demonstrations have gone nearly as violent here in Israel as they were in America several years ago, but they've definitely been massive, and surprisingly to me especially, they've been very, very persistent, which interestingly enough was all part of Ehud Barak's plan, which I'll talk about in just a second. But just to recap, the mass demonstrations that you've been seeing about, also very interesting that the international media and other governments and countries have been so interested in a legislation that Israel's government is actually putting forward, even going so far as to try and stop it. But what you've been seeing about, even in probably your own media, and where the key here is that all of this was planned well in advance, okay? So Ehud Barak, a former prime minister in Israel, part of the radical left now, funded and planned these demonstrations weeks before Israel's government was sworn in and weeks before the judicial reform plan was put on the table. Okay, so they knew it was part of the issue that voters were voting about, and so they said we want to oust Netanyahu and his government, and we're going to take the judicial reform plan and we're going to make that like the headline to get people riled up. Okay, so they were very, very successful. But Ehud Barak, going years back, he has made it very publicly known that his plan all along was to oust Netanyahu. Probably at least partly personal, because he was a very short-serving prime minister, and Bibi Netanyahu is Israel's longest-serving prime minister. But what was really interesting that I didn't get in the first part of the show is that, oh, and by the way, all this stuff is linked down below. So much more information we couldn't talk about, didn't have time to talk about today. So check it out for yourself. But there's a JNS article down below where Ehud Barak was speaking at a think tank in London, I think in March of this year. So halfway through these protests. And he was talking about a book that was written by two researchers, and they had done research on successful protests that had actually like made change in countries from the year 1900 to 2006, so more than a span of 100 years. And he said, according to their research, here there are several things that you need to be successful when you're organizing and putting together protests in a country. He said, one, you only need 3.5% of the country's population, which is a very, very small minority. So in other words, you don't need a lot of people in comparison to the country's population. You just need a small group of people, and you need to make a very loud noise, right? And he said, two, the protests must be persistent. In other words, they must continue week after week after week after week. And the key, these two things are the key to getting a government to either capitulate or to actually fall, which is the end goal in Ehud Barak's mind, is actually to get Bibi Netanyahu to fall and to get Bibi Netanyahu himself out of power. And this is kind of exactly what happened with the anti-judicial reform protest. Now, you might say, "Oh, they were massive protests, hundreds of thousands of people." Sometimes there was at least a few times when there was hundreds of thousands. We went to several of the protests. I'd say more like tens of thousands. But the issue here is that the other issue is that a lot of these people were not there because of the judicial reform protests. We went ourselves and we saw personally a lot of the people there were protesting like in favor of gay pride stuff. There was a huge protest where I actually got yelled at and screamed at personally, the anti-occupation bloc protesters, right? And they were all here at the supposed anti-judicial reform, anti-government protests. So now, number one, there definitely was people that were there trying to do their duty as citizens to protest this, legislation that the government was putting forward. But a lot of those people didn't know while they were there. But the protests were so well organized, so well funded, and so logistically organized that like you could go online and choose the city that you wanted to get transportation from, and then find out when the bus would show up to pick you up, take you to the protest, take you home again that night. It was extraordinarily well organized and well funded that all these people showed up. But the bottom line is, a majority of Israel's citizens voted for Netanyahu's government, voted for his coalition. So even no matter how many people showed up to the anti-judicial reform demonstrations, it was still a minority of Israel's population and still represented a small percentage of Israel's citizens. So they were successful in that. And the other thing they were successful in is that they continued week after week after week after week. They started in January. We're now in June, which I believe I saw one comment from the media that the protests are slowly starting to die down and die off. They have not been in the headlines for some time now, but the issues are still there. And Ehud Barak even said in the JNS article that I'll link down below, he said the two things if you're successful with protests in a country, then you can either get the government to capitulate or to actually fall. And at that point, when he was speaking at this think tank in London, he said, we've already achieved the former, because at that point, Bibi Netanyahu had agreed to pause the judicial reform plan and to reach a compromise, which, by the way, they were not interested in talking about, because Barak's end plan was actually to get the government to fall and to get to Bibi out of power. But he said, we're already successful in the first part of that. So what's the bottom line? Hopefully the judicial reform plan will continue. I believe a part of it will right now, and that'll be Bibi's compromise. It doesn't look like Ehud Barak is going to be successful in actually getting the government to fall, especially when all this information is coming out straight from the mouth of one of his organizers and one of his someone who works very closely with Ehud Barak, saying, oh no, this was planned in advance, it was funded in advance, and all this information. Any thinking person would realize this is not about judicial reform at all. It's not about the key issues that they're claiming to be protesting about, but it's actually about maybe an end to Israeli democracy, which is they're claiming to protest that the government, these things, when in the actuality they're trying to bring down the government, which is really anti-democratic as well, because a majority of citizens voted for Bibi Netanyahu and his government. So bottom line is, don't believe everything you hear on the media, guys. And usually when you see such big headlines like this, there's usually something under the surface that comes out later, but eventually it does come out. Guys, don't forget to click the link in the description below to do your part to provide groceries for those who are living in poverty in Israel. Make sure you subscribe, get that conversation going down below. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think about this issue. As always, tune out the fake news and tune into what is actually happening here in the land of Israel. We're here every Monday through Friday with your direct connection to the land and people of Israel.